In the spring of 1942, a handful of men rode through the darkness toward an occupied island. They weren't an army. There were 6 of them. No tanks, no artillery, no reinforcements, just knives, homemade explosives, and the certainty that if anything went wrong, no one was coming for them. They belonged to a unit barely a year old, a small, unproven band of raiders still writing its own rulebook. That night on Crete, they would write one of its most important pages, but the price would be paid by people who never fired a shot. To understand why 6 men would risk everything on Crete, you have to look 1,000 kilometers south to the Egyptian desert. In 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was pushing the Allies back toward the Nile Delta. His Afrika Korps seemed unstoppable. But an army in the desert doesn't run on courage. It runs on fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. And much of that supply crossed the Mediterranean by air. The waypoint was Crete. After falling into German hands in 1941, the island had become a giant, unmovable aircraft carrier. From its airfields, the Luftwaffe launched transport planes loaded with supplies for Rommel, bombers against Allied convoys, and reconnaissance aircraft that photographed every movement across the southeastern Mediterranean. Destroying those planes from the air was nearly impossible. The airfields bristled with anti-aircraft guns. A massed bombing raid would cost entire squadrons to, at best, damage a few machines. But there was another way, one that had been taking shape in the Mediterranean for over a year. Back in 1940, a commando named Roger Courtney had convinced a room of skeptical Royal Navy officers that a few men in folding canoes could slip ashore from a submarine and strike targets an entire fleet couldn't reach. His unit was called the Special Boat Section. By the summer of 1941, its raiders were already blowing up trains along the Italian coast. Small, cheap, deniable, and devastating out of all proportion to their numbers. By 1942, that idea had a proving ground: Crete. The Allied plan, hatched in Cairo, was ambitious to the point of recklessness. Strike 4 of Crete's airfields on the same night: Heraklion, Castelli, Timpaki, and Maleme. 4 tiny teams, acting in parallel, so the enemy would never know where the blow was coming from. 3 of the teams came from the Special Boat Section. The 4th came from David Sterling's Special Air Service, a sister unit born of the same idea that would soon become a legend of its own. Leading the operation at Heraklion was a 24-year-old with a name that carried weight: George Jellicoe. His father had commanded the British fleet at Jutland, the largest naval battle of the First World War. But the young Jellicoe wasn't chasing great fleets. He was chasing the small, the silent, the impossible to trace. Alongside him, 4 men of the Free French, led by Georges Berger, and a Greek guide, Lieutenant Kostas Petrakis, without whose knowledge of the terrain the mission was doomed before it began. The tool of the trade was as crude as it was lethal: the Lewis bomb, an improvised explosive designed by the raiders themselves, light enough to carry on foot for kilometers, yet powerful enough to tear the wing off a bomber. The infiltration would come from the sea. A Greek submarine, the Triton, would drop them off the coast. From there, inflatable boats. From there, their own feet. In theory, because on Crete, plans had a habit of breaking against reality. On the 10th of June, 1942, at dawn, the Heraklion team made landfall, but not where it should have. Instead of Carteros Beach, the current had dragged them to the Gulf of Malea, far to the east, and hours behind schedule. The first rule of a covert operation had just broken. They no longer knew exactly where they were, and the clock was running against them. There was only one option left: walk. By day, they hid among the rocks and olive groves, motionless, as German patrols passed within meters. By night, they marched toward the airfield. 2 full days of advancing in the dark and vanishing with the sun. On the night of the 12th to the 13th of June, at last, they reached the perimeter of Heraklion. And then, the war handed them their one piece of luck of the night. As they closed on the fence, the RAF appeared in the sky. An Allied bombing raid, planned with no connection to it, fell on the airfield. In the chaos of the explosions and the searchlights hunting for planes, 6 men slipped through where no one was looking. They moved between the rows of aircraft, placing the Lewis bombs one after another. When the charges began to detonate, around 20 Junkers Ju-88 bombers were burning on the runway. But Heraklion was only one of 4 targets, and not all of them shared the same luck. At Malem, Captains Keeley and Allott arrived after an exhausting march, only to run into an invisible wall. The Germans had just ringed the airfield with an electrified fence. Impossible to breach. They withdrew without firing a shot. At Castelli and Timpaki, the SBS teams did their work and fell back toward the evacuation point on the southern coast. On the 23rd of June, Jellicoe, Petrakis, and the men from Castelli and Timpaki were evacuated from a southern beach aboard a kaik, a humble Greek fishing boat. They reached Egypt just before Rommel took the port. But not everyone escaped. The French team at Heraklion was captured. Berger survived the interrogations and ended up in Kolditz, the fortress where the Germans locked away the prisoners impossible to hold. The youngest of his men, Pierre Leostic, never lived to turn 20. On paper, Operation Albumen was a success. 25 aircraft destroyed. Many more damaged. A real blow to the Luftwaffe's ability to supply Rommel at the most critical moment of the desert campaign. The failure to stop these raids was one of the reasons the German military governor of Crete was relieved of his command. But the tactical success cast a long shadow. On the 3rd of June, even before the attack, 12 citizens of Heraklion had been executed. On the 14th of June, the day after the sabotage, 50 more inhabitants of the region were shot in reprisal. Today, an avenue in modern Heraklion bears a name that refuses to let the count be forgotten: the Avenue of the 62 Martyrs. The raiders struck and vanished into the night. The people of Crete stayed behind to live with the consequences. A year later, in July 1943, the raiders returned to Crete. This time, one of the teams was led by a Dane, his own men called the Terrible Viking, Anders Lassen. That night, he walked into an airfield posing as a German officer, deceiving the sentries in their own language. Lassen would become a legend of the Special Forces, and the only foreigner, the only non-Commonwealth soldier, to receive the Victoria Cross in the entire Second World War. He didn't live to accept it. He fell in Italy in 1945, weeks before the end. The special boat section that raided Crete had not been born on that island, but it was raids like Albumen, audacious, imperfect, paid for in blood on both sides, that turned a small experiment in canoes and homemade bombs into something permanent. That unit would grow into the Special Boat Service, today the Maritime Special Forces Unit of the United Kingdom, sister to the SAS and one of the most secretive on the planet. Operation Albumen didn't change the course of the war on its own, but it proved something that would define the next century of conflict: that a few men, well-trained and willing to disappear into the night, could weigh as much as a battalion. The idea survived. The units that inherited it are still operating today, in the dark, just as they did that night on Crete. Beneath every great operation lies a layer that's rarely told. If this story kept you to the end, subscribe. Every video unearths an operation history, left buried,